Hello and welcome back to Comics Over Time. This season, which we're calling Murdock and Marvel, a history of Marvel Comics starring Daredevil, we're breaking down the year in the comic book industry in two parts. In part one, we'll look at the state of the comic book industry as a whole, as well as what things were going on in society that may have impacted the comic book industry during that year. We'll talk big picture about what's going on at DC and independent comics, then we'll shift our focus to Marvel. We'll look at who is creating comics, what new characters or storylines were introduced, and which comics debuted or ended. In part two, we'll dive deep into Marvel's longest running characters, Matt Murdock. We'll look at what the year had in store for the Man Without Fear, key things that happened, and who joined or left his world before spotlighting one key issue or story. From there, we'll wrap up the year's discussion with a takeaway before moving on to another year and a whole new discussion. We're excited to have you join us on a trip through comic book history. We're back for our second half of 1999. I think we're both really excited. My name is Dwayne. With me, as always, my good buddy Dan. Dan, we get to talk Daredevil this week.
Absolutely, some very cool stories. It's gonna be a good time.
And not just Daredevil, but Kevin Smith Daredevil.
Yep. Indeed.
And to be perfectly frank, I just kind of at the get-go, Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti as well, because the artwork in these books actually is pretty cool too. So we don't want to throw any sort of shade towards them here, because they I think are just as much a part of what made this a really good story this year, and why this was, as you said last week, your favorite Marvel title from this year.
Yep. And I think as we talk about it, they're not just, Palmiotti and Quesada are not just part of it. They are a driving force behind this book in a lot of ways, even outside of doing the art on it. So, no.
All right. Why don't we jump in and let's talk about the year for Daredevil. The year in Daredevil.
All right, Dwayne. So we are starting up after a long odyssey through Volume 1. We are starting Daredevil Volume 2. We're not doing quite what we did previously, where we're just talking about the exact 12 issues or whatever that came out in the year. For this one, we are just going to focus on the Kevin Smith era of Daredevil here. Volume 2, issues number 1, actually started back in 98. And then ended in June of 99. It's the Guardian Devil story. Tell us a little bit about this.
So, first let's do like we always do. We talk about all his appearances and stuff. And so this year, if we're talking just 1999, Daredevil had issues 3 through 9, which is most of the Kevin Smith books, 1 through 8, and then the first issue of David Mack's run on Daredevil. A little later on. He was also in Earth X in a couple issues there, the first issue 0, 1, and 2, as well as 5, 6, and 7, Mutant X number 6, Avengers 15 and 16, Avengers Forever number 8, Black Widow 1 through 3, Spider-Man Chapter 1, issues 9 and 12, Fantastic Four, issues 21 and 23, Uncanny X-Men 370, Wolverine Punisher Revelations number 3, Deathlok number 1, and he was also in the Marvel Masterworks Daredevil number 1, Avengers 1999, and the Contest of Champions graphic novel. So he had a decent number of appearances, despite the fact that the kind of catalog as a whole wasn't nearly as big as it's been in years past. As far as this main Daredevil run, the writing credit we talked about, Kevin Smith, who I think we both are really excited to see, and then David Mack, that final issue this year in the next story. Joe Quesada did all these books. Jimmy Palmiotti did the inks for all these books. And really, as you point out, there is one story. The year for Daredevil actually began in November 1998, when the first book of the Guardian Devil storyline hit comic book stores. So we briefly touched on what happened during the first 2 books a couple weeks ago, but with this storyline taking up half the year, we're going to look at this story in depth as our spotlight for this week. So that's what the bulk of this episode is going to be. Now, after Guardian Devil storyline ended in June, we didn't get another book in the main Daredevil run until December, when we get the start of another multi-book storyline called Parts of a Whole, with a new writer in David Mack. Again, Joe Quesada, Jimmy Palmiotti stay on the title with him. We won't go into much detail on this until we look at Daredevil in the year 2000, but it starts with the Kingpin sending a hitman or hitmen after a stoolie that's being questioned by Nelson and Murdock in their office. And things get off to a bang, to put it mildly. But so as we talk about the year as a whole, there's not a lot here to talk about because the year is this one story. And so I think we should waste no time and just jump right into the spotlight, because there is a lot to talk about. We're talking about 8 issues. We're talking about a new creative team, and a lot happens.
I like the fact that we are just talking about the one story. So, that obviously we'll talk more about David Mack and that storyline that starts up at the end of the year, next year. Being a little flexible on that, I think, just makes it a lot easier for us and for readers.
Yeah,
so,
it gets a little dicey, a little confusing, and you're starting a story and you have to remember what you talked about the previous weeks, a couple of weeks ago, not just for us recording and talking to you about it, but you listening, having to remember what we talked about. This just gives us kind of a clean line to discuss everything that happened.
So I guess the main thing is to just set the stage of kind of reminding people where we left off at the end of Volume 1. So a couple months before this came out, Daredevil gets everything kind of back to where it's supposed to be. Volume 2 kind of surprises you, right? I think is the one thing I want to note to folks who, if you remember where we ended off Volume 1, everything's sort of just different as of the beginning of it, And so I think that's one of the things that we start here. Don't think that Dwayne has forgotten to tell you about a number of issues or whatever. There's just a lot of stuff that's changed without any actual on-panel stuff. So with that, sir, I will leave you to begin your tale.
This week's Spotlight story. All right, so Daredevil Volume 2, let's talk about issues 1 through 8. That starts November 1998, and it goes to June 1999. These are all Guardian Devil, called Guardian Devil, Part 1, Part 2, all the way through to Part 8. And to Dan's point, a lot happens between basically the final issue of Volume 1 and the start of Volume 2, because things just you just sort of dive into a completely different situation for Matt Murdock and Daredevil when the pages of this title open up. So let's talk about what that is. So Daredevil's love interest, Karen Page, breaks up with him because she's confused about her feelings for him. Angry and heartbroken, Daredevil falls back into his Catholic faith for support. Now, while this is going on, a 15-year-old girl who knows his secret identity leaves her baby with Daredevil, claiming that the baby was born without her ever having sex. As he tries to discover more about the child's origins, he's contacted by a man by the name of Nicholas McCabe's, who claims the child is actually the Antichrist, leaving Daredevil with a small crucifix. So this is like the first issue, and we get just this complete 180 as to what is going on. We basically read a Dear John letter from Karen Page at the start of this. So we find out she's left for Los Angeles, and to sort of get away from him and the whole superhero thing and all this. And then he hears basically this girl being chased by some people. Doesn't really get into specifics on that, but she like instantly knows that Matt Murdock, is Daredevil, and leaves this kid with him. I had no idea. Like, to your point, I had no idea what I missed. Like I felt like there was something missing.
Yep. We were dropped off in the middle. And the good nice thing about it is that it was disorienting for us, and it was also disorienting for him. Like that was the
Yes.
whole point, kind of, is he doesn't know what the heck's going on either. And it seems like really Karen has left because she had a job opportunity that seemed good out on the West Coast. She's like, hey, I should follow this. So she takes off. He loses that support system. And then suddenly, there's all these things that start playing on sort of his religious faith. When he sees some of these things, they sort of, he is temperamentally sort of predisposed to maybe be more receptive to this than some folks might be. And so, yeah, that's kind of how it begins, and then we're off and running.
Yeah. So we talked about the artwork a little bit. The artwork in here, very, I'm trying to think of the best way to put it. It looks, it's not like revolutionary. Like we haven't seen, like I feel like we've seen sort of the start of the look that Daredevil has in this before, but it feels very grown up, and it feels like it's got a tinge of sort of darkness to it. And I think it sort of helps with kind of that sort of disorientation that you have about the story being so different from where we left off. And like it looks real, but not like photographic real, but it looks sharp, and it looks vibrant.
Yep.
And I really really liked the art style across this, and I think it's a credit to both Quesada and Palmiotti that this thing looks amazing.
Yeah, the inker is very important for somebody like Quesada because he uses a ton of dark and blacks and stuff like this in his work. But I love the fact that it is really in many ways a prototype for what guys like Humberto Ramos and a lot of other sort of modern Marvel artists are going to do in the 21st century, because it's got a look that is realistic, but also has a little bit of cartooniness to it. Like when you
Yeah.
look at his feet, they all look like kind of, everybody has sort of like clown shoes on, just a little bit. Like they're these big boots and stuff like that. But it looks so good, and the detail and just the fluidness of it. Quesada is just a very cool artist.
Yeah.
It feels cool and modern. I think
Yeah.
there's just no
There,
question about that.
modern is a great way to look at it. I think about like, so we've been talking a lot, you and I, Dan, about Alessandro Capuccio, who was working with Jed McKay a lot on
Sure.
the
Yep.
current version of Moon Knight. And this book, uh, with Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti, feels like the closest thing I've seen so far to something that's coming out now, as far as a look and feel goes.
Interesting. Yeah. I think that it comes through like a, a legacy where you see this, and then guys like Chris Bacallo are coming in and moving off of that. And of course you've got people coming in through all sorts of places. But yeah, with the darks, especially, and some of the sketchy lines, I can definitely see where you'd see some of Capuccio's influences coming out of that. And there's a ton of people from the modern era that are influenced heavily by Quesada and what he was doing. So, not to give too much away, but it also helps when you become the editor in chief of the biggest comic company in the world. People tend to want to impress you by having a style that is compatible with your tastes. So,
Sure.
but yeah.
And I mean, I wasn't necessarily even saying that there was a direct connection. I was just saying that if you'd have told me that this book was printed and released last week, I wouldn't have
Yeah.
been surprised.
Correct.
And
Correct.
and
Absolutely.
and so that's, I guess, where I mean by that.
Yep. That makes perfect sense. So one question. So one of the reasons why Marvel wanted to work with Palmiotti and Quesada was that their company actually had some really spectacular coloring processes and colorists. So one of the things about this too is that the coloring it's really vibrant. I think in some cases maybe too vibrant. Like there's places where it gets a little bit much. The other thing is the lettering. What did you think of the lettering in this? Did you have any trouble at all reading anything? I guess is my question to you.
Well, first, the kind of Dear John letter was actually in sort of this penmanship, like it was a woman's handwriting, from what I remember.
Yep, correct.
Does that sound right? And right. I don't recall having any. I mean, that was a little more difficult than normal to read. But I don't know that I think any of the regular lettering, as far as like speaking bubbles and narration boxes, I don't necessarily think anything jumps out to me.
I think it was mostly those letters that I was talking about. That I think they got a little bit too. The problem is that once you start doing digital lettering and you're using digital sort of like handwriting type lettering, a lot of times it can get really difficult to read. And some of those looked almost more like just art squiggles than actual text early on. So I had some trouble with those.
Okay.
And just in general, I think some of the fonts were a little small, partly because Kevin Smith absolutely poured words onto the page.
Yes.
So they may have had to use a smaller font size than they actually would normally use.
There is definitely a dense use of words throughout this entire story. And as we get deeper in this, there's some monologues that end up going on that definitely felt like I was reading a novel more than I was reading a comic book.
Oh, it's a little crazy, but I think it was, like the first issue, very strong first issue. I liked the splash pages that they use at the beginning of each one for the Guardian Devil. The logo is kind of flowery. It takes a little while to figure out what it actually is, but I think the logo was kind of cool and Art Deco-y. I like that. And really for as dark as the story is, it really looks light in a lot of cases.
Yes. Yes, it does. And as we get into some of the darker themes around this story, that really kind of I don't want to say clashes, but it's definitely a complex sort of arrangement going on between what's being told on the page and then how it looks on the page. So part of the deal with this child being the Antichrist, he tells Matt Murdock that the child is cursed and that bad things are going to start to happen to people in close proximity to this baby. And almost immediately, as soon as we get that information and McCabe's leaves, things start happening. We end up seeing Karen Page. She comes back and visits and reveals that she has HIV from her time being a porn star. His partner, Foggy Nelson, is accused of murdering a wealthy divorcee with whom he is having an affair after she seemingly turns into a demon during their night together. Rosalind Sharp, who is both their boss and Foggy's mother, fires Foggy to avoid having his arrest affect the financial future of the law firm. Matt then quits the firm in disgust because he wants to help his friend and is being forbidden to do so while he works for the company, for the law firm that Sharp's a part of. Daredevil then asks for the assistance of the Black Widow, but then ends up attacking her, apparently convinced that McCabe's is telling the truth about the child. Daredevil, in fact, at that point, throws the baby off the roof of the building where they're talking, prompting the Black Widow to leap off herself, saving the child. They end up fighting. He ends up injuring the Black Widow through all this before she ends up leaving with the child. It is just a whirlwind of events across about a book and a half to almost 2 books, I think, across this all this stuff happening. It is crazy how much happens through.
This whole throwing the baby off the roof thing. Who does that? I mean,
I no, you're like I'm actually like starting to get nervous while I'm holding the book, and like it's a good thing it's a digital, so I'm on the iPad, and because like I think my hands were sweating by the time I got to this point, and like I just almost sort of I almost had to put the iPad down when he's talking about doing it and then actually does it. And of course Natasha's like like she is just like, you have got to be kidding me. You are not considering this.
Well, yeah, and then he like attacks. I mean, luckily for those of you who maybe haven't read or don't remember, they explain a little bit of how this happens later. But
Yes.
still,
At the time you're reading this, you're like, oh my God.
and it's weird because the other thing is that in the first 2 or 3 books, him throwing the baby off the roof is like the only action we actually get. There's very little that actually goes on in these comic books in terms of there's so much talking and so much plot development and things like this. But in terms of people actually doing super heroic fighting and stuff like that, it just doesn't hardly even exist.
No, there was a lot of table setting, is what I will put it in there, where we had to be sort of explained what the room was and the things in the room and everything that was going on, and yeah, that didn't leave a lot of time for. I mean, you had this, and then you had sort of there was this little action sequence involving Foggy and the divorcee who ends up like falling out a window and dying when she after this whole demon thing, and like looks like she as the demon is going to attack him, and this sort of thing, and it was just so weird.
There you go. So continue on wherever we're at as far as the thing, and I will try not to worry about the whole baby thing for a little while. We'll see what happens here.
Probably a good idea. So Daredevil goes back and speaks with Karen. She has been contacted by McCabe's. Actually, she was at Murdock's apartment, and McCabe showed up at his apartment to try and continue the urging of giving up the baby, who claims that the child is responsible for her HIV because he's explained to her that the child is cursed and tried to link the fact that the HIV was caused by this. And so she's now thinking that's the case. Daredevil then goes to Dr. Strange for help. Strange tells Daredevil that the cross McCabe's gave him was tainted with an undetectable drug, which made him hostile whenever someone suggested that the baby was innocent. Hence the whole thing with the baby off the rooftop sort of thing. Revealing that that was the cause of his attack on the Black Widow. Strange is then able to purge the drug from Daredevil's system. They then decide that they're going to summon Mephisto for information about the drug, about the baby, all this sort of thing. Daredevil and Strange learn that the church where Murdock left the baby is under attack. So I should have mentioned that Black Widow came back with the baby, and they ended up putting it at the church where Matt Murdock's mom is. So we had this, and so Doctor Strange and Daredevil learn that church is being attacked. Daredevil arrives just in time to confront Bullseye, who has murdered several of the nuns, and Daredevil is unable to stop Bullseye before killing Karen and stealing the baby. I say this again, Bullseye kills Karen Page and steals the baby. Oh my God. Deja vu all over again.
Now, technically, he does throw the club with the intent, I think, of killing Daredevil. And
Yes, he
Karen
does.
sacrifices herself by throwing herself in front of it.
That is
So,
correct.
because of that, it is more of a slightly more layered thing than the just the size into the chest from the previous time, but nonetheless heartbreaking. And this did make me kind of unhappy. We've got the whole women in refrigerators thing and stuff like that we've talked about for years. This is
Yes.
another of those. Kevin
Uh-huh.
Smith just tools into an existing comic, finds a female character hanging around that Stan Lee created, along with, Ditko and those guys, the better part of 50 years ago, and then just, slaughters her for plot purposes. I am a little bit disturbed by that. Now, I also think that in terms of where Daredevil has gone since, Karen was a difficult character because so much had happened. And I think that Marvel had the problem with Spider-Man and the long-term relationship that maybe they just didn't want to have Daredevil settled down and they wanted to have him back out, with his sort of male prostitute ways, wandering around with all of the girls as he does. Um, but it was still tough to kind of stomach that we get this character, suddenly all these terrible things happen to her, and then she's dead. And literally 5 issues earlier, everything was fine, and she was hanging out at, work while Daredevil's having ice cream with his mom. And none of this stuff was in any way what we would expect. So, yeah. How did you feel about this?
I crushed, actually. Like, so Karen has not always been my favorite character across these books, all of volume one. Like, I think she's a good love interest, or has been a good love interest. I think that she's played an important role in Matt Murdock slash Daredevil's life that we've seen through volume one. But I was shocked that we were going to see her killed like this. And then to have it be Bullseye of all people, who killed Elektra, who was the other one of the two other big love interests that Matt Murdock has had through volume one. Even if it was that wasn't necessarily the intent, that's ultimately what ended up happening. The the look across the rest of these pages was pretty graphic too. If I'm being honest, the
Oh,
pictures of the church and the nuns, they're just bodies everywhere and blood and so this wasn't for kids. This story and specifically these few pages, and it sort of felt like a gut punch when I saw all this.
that double page spread, yeah, of the carnage in the church that was not cool. That
Not
was
easy
nasty.
to not easy to
No,
look at. No.
no. And I do think that, I with the way everything turns out, if something bad is going to happen to Daredevil, it seems like Bullseye is going to be the one who's responsible for it. So that part made some sense to me. Um, but just the the way that the whole thing ended, I think was tough. And especially the fact that, again, if it was somebody who'd told 50 or 60 issues worth of stories on Daredevil and had sort of put in the time to develop characters and to build Karen up and then sort of put their mark on her first, maybe then you'd get a little bit more. But as much as I love Kevin Smith, as much as I really enjoyed this story, I still think it's cheap when creators come onto a book and simply take all the equity out of a character permanently. Take everything they're going to have and everything they're ever going to have from a character that was created by somebody else and developed over the space of decades. So, yeah.
Yeah. And
But
we
in any case,
yeah.
it's done. Let's continue
It's
on.
yeah.
What happened next?
So we get a funeral and we get We get condolences from a lot of different people that we know, both kind of superheroes and their and regular folk that are a part of Matt Murdock's life. And we actually see that Matt Murdock briefly contemplates suicide as a result of this, before he then turns and starts tracking that Nicholas McCabe's to his headquarters, fighting his way to a final through the final stronghold, where McCabe's then actually reveals himself to not be who we think he is, and that he is actually the villain Mysterio. It's revealed that he was disappointed when he was deduced from newspaper articles that the current Spider-Man was just a clone, and saw no dignity in overpowering a copy, which is that Ben Reilly, Peter Parker scenario thing that I think we talked about over the last couple weeks, and everything that was going on there. Even though at this time the clone had been killed and the current Spider-Man was the original, I think they had fixed all of that.
They had
and things
fixed
were
it
back
by then.
Yeah.
But Mysterio didn't know that when he was planning
No.
all of this.
No.
It took him a while. So
yes.
yeah.
So we find out a year ago, Mysterio was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor, and he resolved to die after enacting his greatest scheme. And after seeing that Peter Parker, Spider-Man, wasn't up to getting this great scheme, he actually mentions that insurance fraud scheme that we saw near the end of Volume 1.
Yep.
And he basically said, I'm going to turn my attention to Daredevil. He's a worthy hero to have my final scheme go up against. So Mysterio purchases information about Daredevil from the Kingpin and began to set up this scheme. He used artificial insemination to impregnate the girl. He drugged Foggy Nelson. He faked the demonic transformation and the death of the divorcee. He posed as Karen's doctor to fake the HIV diagnosis. He hired the Bullseye to lure Daredevil to him for that final confrontation. This was all a big monologue, and we're seeing panel after panel of this scheme getting put into place. And it is just crazy. Mysterio ultimately believed Daredevil would kill him when he learned of this plot. Daredevil, dismayed at Mysterio for being this unoriginal, pointing out that the Kingpin already made an attempt to drive him insane once before, and that Mysterio had previously attacked J. Jonah Jameson with a fake supernatural occurrences. And so he's like, this isn't even an original idea. This isn't some great scheme.
Mm-hmm.
And so Mysterio, despondent, he gives up this baby, and then, noting that his last move was stolen from the Kraven, that he just couldn't come up with anything original, he ends up shooting himself. So it was so just absolutely crazy. It makes sense. It was the big kind of 3/4 of the way through the film, you have the villain do the big monologue and maybe even have this like montage of things that happened that sort of explains everything. And it explains everything, but at the same time, it's just like, oh my God, you went through all this?
He could have made himself. I mean, if you think of the talents this man had to have just to become a second-rate villain, he could have been anything. He could have been one of the world's great actors. He could have been a billionaire inventor. He could have, I don't know, remade an entire town or whatever with some sort of super technology. And yet, no, he's just busy trying to find a clever way to kill a guy. It's a very strange story, and I think it's almost funny that there's that point where Kevin Smith almost admits, he's like, this is just ridiculous. This is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. So he
It's
kind of outs himself on the fact that
the
I've
wink
just
and the
written
nudge. Yeah.
a crazy story. And I think that partly comes from, if you look at how this story came about, that do you know how he got to be the writer on this in the first place?
I do not have any clue how this happened.
So we should maybe finish up first, but we'll just do it now, just so you get an idea
Yes.
of why this becomes so convoluted. So Palmiotti and Casada actually worked on some of the art for a movie that Smith did called Chasing Amy that came out a couple of years before Smith wrote the book. And so that was how they first sort of met with him. And he was a comic fan, so he would talk with them a little bit, and they exchanged numbers and everything else. And at a certain point, once Casada and Palmiotti are given Marvel Knights, and they're given this new Marvel imprint, one of the books they get is Daredevil, and evidently they talked to Kevin Smith and knew that he was a big fan of Daredevil and of the Frank Miller era and Daredevil and everything else. So Palmiotti, or I think it was Casada, called him up and said, "Hey, how would you like to write Daredevil?" And evidently Kevin Smith said, "Sure, I'd love to."
Sure.
And according to him, he says sure to everything. So
Oh,
he had like 2 movies in production and all sorts of other stuff. So he proceeded to say yes and then forget about it and do nothing for a long time, even as Casada and Palmiotti are now selling like the Marvel executives and everything on the Marvel Knights line and everything, partly based on the fact that they've got Kevin Smith writing Daredevil. And at a certain
uh-oh.
point, Casada's like, "You've missed a bunch of deadlines. We need you to do this." And Smith just says, I just don't think I have time. I'm not going to be able to do it. At which point, evidently, Casada hangs up and just, goes off to weep. And Palmiotti, who's kind of this guy with big, mutton chops and everything, he's a little bit more direct, called him back and just gave him what for and said, "Dude, you promised us this." And so Smith said, "Okay, I'll do it. I guess I owe you that." He was watching a movie at the time that roughly had the same plot as Guardian Devil. And so
Oh
that's how
my
he's
God.
and so that's how he started. He's like, "I'll just write based off of this B movie, horror movie that I'm seeing." But then about halfway through, they're like, "Man, we got Daredevil throwing babies off roofs and all
Oh,
sorts of
jeez.
we got to find a way to fix this or people are just going to, lose their shit." And so they went back and then redid the story halfway through to make it so that, he's being drugged and everything to explain all this crazy behavior. But Smith had never really written a comic book script before. He had no
Sure.
idea what he was doing. And the whole thing was just crazy. It's also interesting if you look at the first few issues of the Guardian Devil books. If you look at the signature block from Palmiotti and Casada, it's actually got the Daredevil book number continuing from 380. So, like, if you look at issue number 3 and issue number 4 of Daredevil Volume 2, if
Uh-huh.
you look at the actual original art or even the printed art for the cover, it says like 383 and 384 under their signature block. So I don't know, kind of like we'd talked that they weren't expecting to be canceling this thing. I don't know they were planning on canceling it. I think it was Smith just kind of causing so much trouble that they eventually canceled it and started the renumber because they just didn't know what they were going to do as far as the time.
Oh my.
So, but that was how it all kind of got started, evidently, is that they had met him while they were, or gotten connected with him while they were doing that. And this is something that had been happening more and more because, Straczynski, he's a Hollywood guy. He's coming out now.
Yeah.
Bendis had been trying to sell some of his stuff out in Hollywood. So he's got, the sellout book that he's publishing like this year or last year and the like. You're starting to get these connections. And so this was a big one for Marvel to get an actual, like this is the same year Dogma came out. So this was Kevin Smith's like glory days, really. You've
Yeah.
got Chasing Amy was big, coming on the heels of Clerks. Dogma is one of my favorite Kevin Smith movies. You can't get it now because
Yeah.
licensing stuff and the like. But fantastic stuff. And all of this kind of led to them going, "Hey, you want to write a comic book?" And then eventually he kind of, you wouldn't think that he didn't have time to do it considering the amount of words he put into it. But that
Yeah.
was that was
I mean,
nonetheless, yeah.
yeah. And yet and yet it's still sort of it still ends up sort of working.
Oh
If
yeah,
I'm being truly honest, it's
it's
like
fantastic.
it's rough, and like, the motive, like the motives for Mysterio feel weird. I mean, but like, the baby thing is just crazy as all get out. But at the same time, you're just like, it had Bullseye
Mhm.
killing Karen Page, and so you got this gut punch in there as well. I mean,
Yeah, but I mean, the thing is, Smith is a good writer, and
he
what he was
is.
writing at here really played to his strengths and played to Daredevil's strengths. And then you've got Casada and Palmiotti, kind of like you said, just really do knock it out of the park. These pages are fantastically beautiful. I think the coloring, most of the coloring was done by, I think it's like Brian Haberlin Studios. So Dan Kemp was the one on the first one. It might have changed as they went along, but it was the studio that did a lot of the work with Palmiotti and Casada going in. Uh, Comicraft did the lettering and everything. They were at the top of the game in terms of the digital lettering studios. And then we actually had somebody called Nancy DeCasian, who was the editor. And that's actually soon going to be Nancy Casada. So she actually ends up marrying Joe. And so I think her editing must have been part of what brought this around too. So
Yeah,
you had to have had somebody who was going, okay, this has got to make sense at a certain point.
calm
Because,
down here a little bit. Yeah,
as crazy as it is, it does all tie together and it's fun,
yeah.
you know. Um, but yeah, I think there must have been times in the dark of the night when Casada and Palmiotti were like, oh my God, we've made a horrible mistake, you know. and and instead, no, it a little bit late, but it all worked out. So
So let's wrap up this story. So after Karen's funeral, a conversation between Spider-Man with Spider-Man leads Daredevil to realize the infant he had saved represented a positive outcome among all this tragedy that ended up occurring. His faith is renewed, and he ends up naming the baby Karen and gives it up for adoption to a couple in New Jersey. He visits the Black Widow, asks for forgiveness. After Foggy is released from jail, he and Matt visit the site of their old office. Matt suggests that he uses Karen's money, which was left to him in her will, to reopen their own practice. So, in a roundabout way, things ended up sort of back to normal-ish for Daredevil, and where, a kind of sort of a setup shop, and Nelson and Murdock, attorneys at law, are back together again. There's just
mhm.
not going to be Karen Page going forward.
Yeah, gonna rebuild the brownstone that Kingpin blew up all the way back in the Born Again storyline. Smith in a lot of ways really does set up the next generation of Daredevil because he brings a lot of the characters back to where they were, like back to that status quo. We get Murdock and Nelson out of that crazy office with Nelson's mom. We get them back into the brownstone. Really, the main thing is losing Karen. And again, because of all the different girlfriends that Daredevil traditionally has had over the years, it might have just been that things were getting too serious with Karen, and they decided that they had to have some way to take her out of the picture, to return him back to being kind of the bachelor that he was for most of the early part of the Daredevil runs. So
Yeah. And you still got Natasha Romanoff around that is looking
yeah,
out for him, and that sort of thing. And so the interesting thing I will say about this is there's really no mention of Kingpin at all in this story, which sort of surprised me a little bit. And I don't know if I was expecting to see Elektra, but I sort of was expecting to see Elektra, and there was really no mention of her, or we didn't see her at all either.
Well, Smith talked about that at some point. At that juncture, we had the Elektra Lives Again or Elektra Rises or whatever it was called story by Miller a couple of years before.
Right.
And at the end of that, it was inconclusive whether Elektra was yet again dead.
Okay.
And so Smith had actually talked about how he was uncomfortable with bringing back and using Elektra when he respected what Miller had done so much. He didn't want to, that was his character. He'd created Elektra. He didn't want to, he didn't mind killing Stan Lee's character, but he didn't want to bring back Frank Miller's character. So you see, you see who he really kind of respects there. But yeah,
are you surprised there was no Kingpin?
Well, I mean, they mentioned that, there was the mention of him because Kingpin was still Cordwell, because that's how Mysterio got all the information he needed.
I mean, yeah, I guess there was that sort of in the monologue. He mentioned that Kingpin was how he found out that Matt Murdock and Daredevil were the same person.
Kingpin took $1 million to essentially tell him what, and basically Kingpin had told him to just take a walk until he's like, but I want to drive him mad. It's like, fine, I'll take your money. So Kingpin was still sort of behind all of this, but not intentionally. He was just the information man.
Yeah, okay.
But yeah, normally a story like this, Kingpin would end up being up to it to his elbows, but not in this case. So
I mean, the other thing I'll say about this, there was a lot about this that definitely felt adult and very adult themes, and actually feels very much like something that Kevin Smith would talk about. He talks about Karen with HIV. You had Matt thinking about committing suicide in here. You had, in addition to the action, you had some really serious topics that are being broached throughout all this as well. And there was, a lot of sort of church stuff as well. You have the baby who the 15-year-old thinks is like the next Jesus, the Immaculate Conception. Mm-hmm. And then you have this other guy saying, oh no, this kid's the Antichrist and is a curse to anything around it. So you had a lot of Catholic talk as well, and things.
This guy literally was making dogma at the same time he was writing these.
Sure. Not surprising then, I guess.
But Buddy Christ, all this sort of stuff. So yeah, it's kind of crazy. But I mean, again, it all fit with Daredevil. I think Smith intuitively is a good choice for writing Matt Murdock and Daredevil. The one thing I found weird about it really was even sometimes, with the action, there was one book where at the end of the book, Murdock is like dropped into the front of traffic or something like this, and you're like, oh, we're going to get some action here. And then it ends. And the start of the next book is him like sitting around talking to Natasha. And she's like, yeah, I had to pull you out of traffic and everything. And it's like, even then, he just avoids having anything actually happen. It's a fantastically sort of character-centric story.
I was going to say, this is a story-driven comic, not an action-driven comic here.
It really is. Even when there is action, a lot of it is very truncated. It's not like Gene Colan back in the day where you would have like a 6-page fight scene. That just did not happen in any of these. There were times where he would be like flying across the city skyscape or whatever, but usually he wasn't fighting anybody. He was just jumping. And so nonetheless, none of these are really complaints. They're more observations. I think it was a lot of fun. And more than that, what we're going to find with Daredevil, with these books, and then I think with David Mack and Bendis taking over, is in many ways what Quesada and Palmieri are doing with the Marvel Knights line and the people they're bringing in. because Mac is another friend of theirs that they bring in to do stuff. Really, this sets the tempo for what comics are going to be in the 21st century. There's a reason why you're like, this could have been published last week, is that so much stuff templates off this. You know, the look of it, the vibe of it. Daredevil is going to become a fundamentally important building block for how modern comics look and feel. I also find it interesting that you've got Kevin Smith writing these, and then Brian Bendis is going to come in within a couple weeks, because the difference between those two men as writers cannot be more stark. You know, because
Yeah.
Bendis is all about sort of show don't tell, and as he
Yeah.
goes, he more and more pares down the dialogue, and he also very rarely, especially later, does anything that's internal monologue. So you don't get much for people thinking or any of that sort of like the long exposition. Whereas there's fantastic amounts of exposition and people just thinking and talking here in the Kevin Smith stuff. You know, so much of it. A lot of times he uses captions instead of thought balloons, but you're inside people's heads, inside Murdock's head all the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, but it is really interesting, and yeah, these just feel so much different than the Chichester book that we got just a couple of weeks ago, or those last few books, even the ones that we liked that were
Yeah.
coming out of the 90s, you know?
Yeah.
So
I would recommend this. I liked this, but it is because it definitely feels modern, feels very much like something I could have picked up at the comic book store right now. It's just it also, I think, plays off the sort of investment I have of the characters too. Like I don't think the church scene would have been quite as impactful to somebody who didn't have the backstory of Bullseye, had the kind of on again off again thing between Karen and Daredevil, for it to really be this thing. And then even at the end, just feeling like, oh man, Foggy and Matt are getting back to where they began. They're going to start their own law firm again. It's just going to be the two of them. It's yeah.
I will 100% say that Karen's death did not affect me when I was reading these back in the day the way it did rereading them, because I hadn't just read 380 Daredevil books, many of which you saw that development of and the crumbling of that relationship, and then them putting it back together and how important she'd become to him.
Yeah.
And then it's just over. And so I think that this was there was a time where he's talking to Spider-Man, where Spider-Man sort of references Gwen Stacy. And I think there is a point at which this really is his Gwen Stacy moment.
An allegory. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's tough, but nonetheless they were really good books. It's been fun reading through them. It's also interesting to see now just how much the book changes over the next few issues. So this is like almost a little diversion where you get this 8-issue run with Kevin Smith, and it's the bridge between what was and what is to be, So, but also, if you're a fan of Kevin Smith's movies, you will probably really like these books. If you don't like some of Kevin Smith's movies, there's a good chance you might not like some of these comics, because they really do feel like a Kevin Smith production.
Yes, they do. They definitely do. The last thing I'll say is the artwork definitely has put Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti really high on my list of artists I now like.
Yep.
And I'm excited to see what they're going to do with Daredevil going forward with David Mack.
No. What's interesting is Palmiotti is not even the best artist in his own family, as far as I'm concerned. So there you go. His wife, Amanda Connor, is absolutely fantastic. She's one of my favorite all-time artists. So
Hey.
But in actual fact, he does incur a lot, and the two of them together are really, really a fantastic duo.
All right. I think we've covered Guardian Devil about as well as we can. Dan, should we move in and talk some of the rapid fire questions?
All right, bring it on. Let's do it. You ready?
Yes.
Who was Matt Murdock in love with this year?
Well,
question.
Karen Page, though she's gone at the start of the book, writing the Dear John letter, moving to LA. She returns, telling him she has HIV, and then ends up being this pawn in Mysterio's plan to get Daredevil, and then dies. It is heartbreaking.
No, but definitely this is the year where he's pretty much settled in on. We know he's taken it pretty hard, even before she dies. The leaving. Our biggest villain of the year?
Obviously Mysterio, though we don't know that it's Mysterio from the outset.
Really? Did Mysterio throw a baby off of a building?
No, he did not. So yes, I guess there could be a good also ran in this story.
I guess. Did we see Matt practicing law this year?
Not really. He ends up quitting the law firm when he's not allowed to defend Foggy, though it does seem like by the end of the series that he's going to start practicing law again with Foggy Nelson.
And the fact he was a lawyer didn't matter, at least, because he had to make his stand and quit because of all that. So,
right.
Anyone know Matt's identity?
Obviously, Mysterio learns the identity by buying the information from the Kingpin. So,
and the girl who we find out in like a later thing, she's been dispatched with and like killed. So that was terrible. But yeah. So, and I think a few other people too. But literally, I think Mysterio killed pretty much everybody who he had to tell to get the thing to work. So
yeah,
there we go. Is Daredevil still a good guy this year?
So my note here on this was, well, he did try to kill a baby by throwing it off a rooftop. So I don't think you get to be called a good guy if even drugged, you are going to potentially do that.
Tried to hit Doctor Strange over the head with a pipe and attacked Black Widow, and yeah, he had his moments this year. Let's put it that way. But I think in general, yeah, once they got the stuff out of his system, he did what he could. Did the Daredevil outfit or equipment change? Anything interesting there?
I didn't notice any costume changes or any Billy Club changes this year.
I would argue that there was.
Okay.
And it's all because of Joe Quesada and the fact that he just draws the Billy Club cord differently and more than anybody you've ever seen. Like, I don't know that anybody else had previously had the cord extended between the two cables the way he does and just have it like winding all over the place.
Okay.
And if you look, there's all of these panels where he's got the cord extended, and it really becomes almost more like a jump rope kind of thing with this long cord.
It definitely does look like almost like a jump rope.
And I don't know that anybody's done that before.
A really long jump.
Yes, like a Galactus jump rope type of thing. But
my assumption sort of is like it's always been like that. We just never really see it like that, the way we see it during these books.
Absolutely agree. Yep, he just did it differently. Anything new about Matt's past?
I don't feel like I mean, we sort of kind of get some of the sort of in between the end of last volume and this volume a little bit, but no, I don't know if there's anything real.
No, I would agree.
Comes to this.
I think so.
Nothing that wasn't core to the current story that Kevin Smith was trying to tell.
No. And what was the biggest moment of the year?
Bullseye kills Karen.
Yeah.
After the church nuns and it's Matt's mom too presumably has died in this as well, because she's
she does not.
She does not?
She does not.
Well, she's definitely injured.
She is injured.
And
She's like one of the very few that survives.
okay, I sort of made the assumption that Matt's mother dies in this as well. But she was sort of kind of helping Karen get out of the church
Yeah,
before Karen ends up jumping in front of the Billy Club.
that is correct. They were what, and she was trying to, like, Karen had the fake baby and was trying to trick Bullseye while the mom snuck out the other direction. And so, yeah, that was kind of how that worked. So,
Okay.
isn't that old lady that he's talking to at the end when he talks about naming the baby? Isn't that his mom?
I thought that was just some random nurse or something.
She says, with your hand on the glass that way, can you feel them? Like, yeah, I'm breathing, the glass heats up and expands, and I can hear them inhale. I never knew that. So, yeah, it's definitely somebody who knows who he is. So I'm pretty sure that's his mom.
I
So,
I distinctly disagree, but that's just me. I thought that was just some nurse or some social worker that he was talking to.
all right. Well, we'll worry about that later. So anyhow,
Okay.
I guess we'll find out if she shows up later. But yeah. Anything else? No, I agree with you 100% on the biggest moment. I mean, it pretty much has to be. That was, although I do think that there have been a lot of people who talk about the whole throwing a baby off the roof part as well. But that was an
I
early
mean,
big moment because you're like, okay, who is this guy at this point? He has lost it, you know.
I mean,
So
until Karen gets hit with the Billy Club, that was the biggest moment, and then it just sort of. I mean, it's definitely a big moment. It just to me isn't the biggest moment. This week's takeaway. All right, Dan, we're going to actually get the takeaway as part of the Daredevil episode this week, so we don't have to go 3 parts for the second week in a row. You're looking at 1999. The year closes out. We're going to the year 2000. DC has a big year. Marvel is honing, I guess, their line right now. They're having some big names coming in. Where do we take away? What is the big takeaway for 1999?
I mean, to me, the takeaway is that you are starting to see new creators, new ideas sort of take hold in the industry that are going to be the things they're able to build around. You know, when you look at 100 Bullets, you look at Daredevil, you look at some of the new creators that we're starting to see come in, like Bendis and some of these folks. A lot of the building blocks of what's going to become that comic book renaissance are taking root here. And to be quite frank, Joe Quesada coming in with Marvel Knights is massively important because he's going to take over as editor-in-chief soon, and he's going to really revolutionize the way Marvel does a bunch of stuff. And some of those are things like, you know, One More Day that are going to raise all sorts of hackles, and some of them are changing to try and bring in new heroes and new ways of doing things and new styles of art. But everything that has been going wrong for the last however long, we're going to start seeing turnaround next year. And I think that Daredevil's a big part of it. You know, next year, Ultimate Spider-Man comes out, and that's going to be a massive turning point as well. But I think what you're starting to see is that, notwithstanding what happened this week in Daredevil, a lot of the darkness and the over-the-top sort of action and violence over story elements that sort of were a hallmark of the 90s are being moved aside as you see Alan Moore try to come up with another way to tell superheroic stories. You see Warren Ellis come out with Planetary and the Authority and start to have a more sort of grounded way of looking at a lot of the super teams and the like. There's just so many things going on now that sort of portend a better future, you know? And even things like when we don't just talk about the superhero stuff, the fact that you see Viz Comics hit number 6. That as of right now, if you look at the total comic market in 2024, Marvel and DC are maybe 10 or 15% of it, right? And in fact, superhero comics as a whole, comic book publisher or comic book sales are just a small part of the overall comic book market. And it's because things like Bone are taking hold with Scholastic and stuff like that. A lot of that's starting to hit as we end the decade. It still looks bad because sales keep going down and down and down. But there's a lot of really good things happening. We just got to wait for them to take hold.
That makes sense. It's just looking at the Daredevil run, it does sort of feel like we have seen some foundation pillars sort of put in place for what's going to ultimately be the next 2 decade plus of Daredevil.
Yeah. And if you were reading Iron Man, you'd feel the same way about the stuff going on in Iron Man. You were reading Captain America, you're reading Avengers. All of them have had this same thing over the last few years where they've closed down the original run, rebooted with this new series of titles, sometimes with the Heroes Reborn ones in between, and now they're doing it. But they're starting to build that plan for how they're going to make this work moving forward in the next generation. So, yeah. Now, if you were there in 1999, you would still believe the sky is falling. But in retrospect, we can look at it and go, yeah, things are starting to turn around.
Gotcha. All right, that is going to wrap it up for 1999 and our look at that. And we get to jump ahead to the year 2000 next week. It's going to be really interesting. But we'd like to thank you all for joining us this week. If you're new to the podcast, please consider subscribing on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get each new episode as soon as it's released. If you've already subscribed, we'd appreciate if you'd share the show via social media or leave us a review. That will help new listeners find the show that much easier. Whether you're new to the podcast or you've been with us from the beginning, we'd love to get your thoughts on this week's show. Maybe you read Guardian Devil this week. We'd love to get your thoughts on the books. You can send us those via email, comments@comicsovertime.com, or you can reach out to us in short form via social media on X or Blue Sky @comicsovertime. Dan, you mentioned David Mack, our Rookie of the Year last week. You get to see him in action next week as we start the year 2000. I guess that'll be in a couple weeks when we get to Daredevil. But I'm very curious to see where the comic book industry is going to go starting in 2000.
Yep. So don't expect miracles. But baby steps. That's what we're working on.
It doesn't happen overnight. We just flip the calendar over to 2000 and suddenly things are hunky dory.
But I'm no longer promising the end is near. Instead, we've passed that point, and now we're looking at slightly sunnier skies as we move along. So we'll start talking about them next week.
Sounds good. Until then, take care, everybody.
See you later, folks.